In this video, we're going to take a look at Diamine Scribble Purple. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. I have a lot for purple inks, especially when put with the correct complement color. However, in the past, purples that have been so dark they're like black, I haven't cared for. This one is a very dark purple that's almost black. I normally don't go for that, but this manages to keep its purpleness on the page. It doesn't look black and you know it's purple. It looks so dark a purple, but somehow manages to keep that purple lean in the ink that's on the page, which is very cool, and I really have been enjoying it about this ink. Now, it can shade sometimes, but this ink doesn't look its best when it's shading. It doesn't need the shade to have a real character on the page. The ink itself, in its solid lines, really do pop, especially on certain papers. So for me, I'm looking at this and really surprised that I'm enjoying such a dark purple as much as I am. This also gives a tremendous amount of tone variation depending on the pen. And I tend to enjoy the tone variation that it's giving, especially when it still manages to be a fairly solid line. Again, I don't really need the shading on this ink to make it show as good as it really is. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a TWSBI VAX 700 with a Fountain Pen Revolution broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, it has no feather. It has no spread. It has some shading that's going on, and I want to say it's kind of there. It's not real standout, but it is definitely there. If you look at arm, M is little bit darker than the rest of the word, and we get a bunch of that as we go, like the starts a bit darker and works its way a little bit lighter. It's a fair purple here. On medium, it's much darker than it was with the fine as a whole as a color. It has no feather. It has no spread. It's not shading at all, and it really looks good. It is almost to the point of black, but still looks purple, which is awesome right here. I did not expect to like this as much as I did once I started writing with it. The oblique italic is got no feather, no spread. It is shading much better as you look at the word yards or the words although or one. You see a lot of shading all the way through it, and it does perform very nicely here. If I didn't see how it looked with the medium, I would probably be very happy with how it looks in that oblique italic. It's just, in comparison to the medium, it doesn't have it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Pilot Metropolitan with a fine nib, a Kaweco Sport with a medium nib, a Mr. Pen Italics Chaplin's Tankard with an oblique italic nib. The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, no shading, and that's the paper absorbing that shading right up. Now, I do think it still manages to hold on to that purple color here, and it comes right up to the edge of black. The medium is darker than the fine with no feather, no spread, no shading. No doubt the best version that's going to be on this page. It is really good, and while I say it's darker than the fine, it still manages to be a purple and not a black. The oblique italic has no feather, no spread. It does shade, even on this more absorbent paper. It definitely shows the most of the purple that this ink has, which it does it really well, and it looks really good. Again, I fall back on I really prefer how it's looking from that wet medium. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting and no bleeding. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We do get a little bit of shading that's going on. When you look at just the first word, equation, the beginning of the Q is darker than the end of the Q, and the T is darker than the letters around it. Form starts darker and gets lighter. So it shades very nicely here, and it does look really good. In fact, here I'm going to say it's going to look better than what we're going to see in the medium. The medium has no feather, no spread, no shading. The color just looks dull to me here on this paper. It's a reaction from the paper itself. It's not as interesting as it is on the other papers. However, it's not bad. That medium writing just is not for me, without a doubt. The oblique italic has no feather, no spread. It is shading. It's doing fairly okay. It is showing off more of the purple tone than the other nibs have, as it has on the other papers. It still looks really good here. It's just a matter of being able to decide which one you think looks best for you. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting and no bleed through. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, and no shading. Now, what we're getting in the tone is not that very dark, but we're getting much more of the purple here. This paper tends to mute a color a little bit, and I think it's looking very nice on this paper. This ink on this paper really does show very well. The medium is much darker than the fine, still showing as much more of a purple than it did on the other papers. Still looking really good here. It has no feather, it has no spread. It's only got a few light moments of shading, which I could do without in this particular case, but it is doing fairly well. It looks really nice. And it still has this moment of it could be dark enough that somebody would leave you alone if they really wanted a black. The oblique italic has no feather, no spread. Yes, it is giving some shading, as you see in the word circle, where it goes from darker to lighter to darker, or and that goes from darker to lighter to darker. It does really well here. I don't know about this. This is not looking quite, this is, the oblique italic is looking like the very dark purples that I don't tend to care for on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get a normal amount of ghosting and no bleed through. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman number 14. Here is Diamine Violet. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Violet number 3. Here is Robert Oster Viola. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, and some light shading. And I think the light shading here on this paper looks nice. I think it works very well for this. It keeps a very dark purple, and it gets much darker areas, really giving some character that's not showing as well, I think, on the other pages, not showcasing as well. The medium is darker than the fine, with no feather, no spread, no shading. Now, I say it's darker than the fine, but the purple is showing through much better here than it did on the fine nib, which is interesting in how it's doing that. The oblique italic has no feather, no spread. It is about the same tone as the medium. It does have a few moments of shading, which makes me want to say that I would almost expect some bleed through. Let me take back the no feather. If we look at the bottom of the word circle underneath the I to R, you see a tiny bit of feathering that has occurred. So there is a spot. It's just not really that big a deal, especially given the paper. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting, very under control, and no bleeding. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here's a brown ink by KWZ Honey. Here is a green ink by Delta, They're Green. Here is a pink ink by Lamy, They're Vibrant Pink. Here is a green ink by Papier Plume, Moss Green. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, there is a tiny bit of spread, but really not a big deal. There's almost no feathering. I say almost. There's tiny feathers, but for me to really point out where they are, the W in everywhere, the end of the word circumference at the RENC, but it's so under control and really doing a good job, I don't want to pick on it. The medium is a little bit darker than the fine. It does have a lot more feathering than the fine. It's a wetter pen after all. It's under control as feathering goes. It is spreading to between a medium and a broad. It's not shading. It's just a dark, rich purple here. The oblique italic has feathering. We would expect it. It has some spread. We would expect it. It actually has, I'm going to call it moments of shading, only because you certainly do see some dark spots in the writing. Not too bad considering this is that 20-pound paper. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we got no bleeding that touched the page underneath, and I was very surprised by that. As far as ghosting, yes, it gets very deep into the page. Normal amount of ghosting for this paper. Really good performance if you have to use this. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? This ink definitely shades its best from a dry stub. So if you really want to see the shading that this ink has to offer and bring out a bunch of the purple from it, use that dry stub. Now, its tone and personality on the page comes through best, in my opinion, from a wet, regular nib, like a regular fine, medium, or broad. The wetter, the better in this case, because it is so dark and yet still manages to maintain being a purple that I've been enjoying that, which I really like this from a wet broad personally. But it's looked good in all nibs when they're very wet. So it's a dealer's choice as long as it's a really wet pen. Or unless you want shading, then a dry stub. Thanks for watching.